In the vast stillness of rural Montana, a reclusive war veteran rescues a broken dog from a quiet shelter, unaware that the animal is part of a buried military experiment. As the bond between man and dog deepens, long-forgotten secrets rise from the ashes. Tracked by contractors and watched by hidden eyes, the veteran begins a dangerous journey to uncover the truth behind Project Ember, a classified program that rewired war dogs into unfeeling weapons. But Ranger, the dog they thought could be controlled, chooses his own path. As enemies close in and allies emerge from the past, the lines between loyalty and survival blur. Not every wound leaves a scar. Not every soldier walks on two legs, and some legacies refuse to be buried. Will Ranger's story end in silence, or will his final stand become the echo that awakens a nation? Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. The wind rattled the chain-link fence like a warning. Cold and sharp, it sliced through the cracks of the old Montana shelter, carrying with it the scent of snowfall and something heavier, loneliness. Inside Kennel 6, a large black Belgian Malinois sat stiffly, unmoving. His name, as far as the records went, was Ranger, but no one at the shelter used it anymore. They simply called him the aggressive one. Families came and went. They lingered at the cages with hopeful eyes, calling out to the playful, tail-wagging dogs. Some crouched down, hands pressed to the metal, cooing at puppies too young to know what abandonment was. But when they reached Kennel 6, they always paused. Ranger didn't wag. He didn't bark for attention. He stared, eyes hard, unreadable. "If a hand dared get too close," he growled, low and guttural, like a warning carved from instinct. It was always enough. A young volunteer, Maggie, once tried to pet him. He flinched, not from pain but memory. Since that day, no one tried again. He didn't eat in front of people, didn't play with toys. At night, when the shelter closed and the lights dimmed, Ranger paced in silence, his steps methodical, as if counting them mattered. Sometimes he'd stop and sit facing the corner of his kennel, unmoving for hours. No one could say why, but the vet had made notes. Extreme trauma, possible combat background, no visible injuries, unadoptable. A rusted tag hung from the collar, buried under his thick coat. Most didn't notice it. It was just another piece of scrap, forgotten like the dog who wore it. But the tag told a different story, a story no one at the shelter had ever read. Not until the day a man stepped through the door with hands scarred and boots still caked in the dust of old battles. Frank Holloway had never been the kind of man who wandered into places by chance, but that Tuesday something pulled him in. Maybe it was the voice of his old friend Earl, who'd said last week over coffee, "You need something breathing in that house besides horses, Frank." Or maybe it was the silence that had begun to weigh too heavy out on the prairie, long after the gunfire had stopped. The shelter door creaked as he entered. Fluorescent lights buzzed above him, and the smell of ammonia clung to the air. A teenage girl at the counter looked up from her phone. "Looking to adopt?" she asked, though her voice lacked any real interest. Frank nodded, but didn't speak. He hadn't spoken much since he came back. Not after the ranch, the desert, or the funerals, especially not after the last one. He walked past cages of wagging tails and hopeful eyes. The noise was deafening, barking, whining, claws against steel. But he kept walking, boots slow on the concrete, until the sound began to fade. Until he reached the end of the row, Kennel 6. The dog didn't move. Their eyes met. Ranger didn't snarl, didn't pace. He simply stared. And Frank, he froze. Something in him shifted. The stillness, the silence. It was familiar. "Don't get too close to that one," the girl warned, her sneakers squeaking as she approached. He's been here a long time. Nobody wants him. He's unpredictable, maybe even dangerous." Frank didn't move. His eyes narrowed. On the collar, Something glinted beneath the fur. He knelt slowly, ignoring the girl's protests, and gently reached through the bars. The tag was old, crusted in rust. Answered once. A long, low sound. Frank stiffened. It wasn't the usual bark. He lifted the rifle and scanned the ridgeline. Nothing moved. Then a second bark, closer this time. Not Ranger. Another dog. Familiar, but not the same. Frank turned back, heart shifting in his chest. He walked fast, rifle at his side. At the edge of the barn, Ranger was standing now, tail high, body angled toward the woods. Bravo stood behind him, alert. Both dogs facing the same direction. A shape appeared near the edge of the trees, thin, mud-covered, limping. Another dog. Frank lowered the rifle. Elaine stepped out onto the porch, already reaching for her jacket. Frank stared at the animal as it approached. Its ears were torn, fur patchy, one eye scarred, but it moved with purpose. Toward the porch, toward the dogs. Ranger didn't growl. He stepped forward. The stranger dog collapsed at the bottom of the steps. Frank knelt beside it, his hands moving. Instinctively, he found the tag buried in the matted fur. No name, just a number, another one of theirs, one more forgotten. He looked over his shoulder. Elaine was already coming with a blanket. Inside that night, Ranger lay close to the new arrival, as if shielding him. Bravo rested nearby, head up. No one slept. Frank stood at the window long after midnight. He knew there would be others. Some wouldn't make it this far. Some wouldn't be able to be saved. But he also knew this wasn't just about Ranger anymore. It never had been. It was about what came next. Not vengeance, not exposure, but healing. And maybe, if they were lucky, something like peace. I never thought we'd see this. You earned it, Frank said. He did. A little boy approached Ranger slowly, his hand half raised. The dog looked up at Frank, then at the boy, and held still. The boy crouched beside him, ran his fingers down Ranger's back, then turned to look up at the statue. He didn't say anything. He just stayed there, one hand on the reel, the other on the bronze. Frank swallowed hard. In the distance, he noticed a man standing under a tree, holding binoculars. Not obvious, not out of place, but watching. Frank didn't move, didn't say anything. Elaine followed his gaze and gave a slight nod. Not the last of them, she said. They'll keep circling. Frank turned back to the statue. Then we let them watch. They stayed until the sky darkened and the crowd thinned. A few people left flowers by the base. A ribbon with a unit number. A photograph of a handler and his partner. Bravo stood, finally, walked over to the statue on his own, sniffed the base, then sat beside it, calm. It wasn't until they were almost to the truck that Frank noticed someone had placed a second plaque at the edge of the garden. Smaller. Simple. Every family rejected him, until one didn't. He ran his fingers over the words and looked down at Ranger, who watched him with quiet eyes, ears soft, tail still. That night, back at the cabin, Frank sat on the porch with Elaine while the dogs dozed in the grass. The stars were coming out one by one, cold and clean above the ridgeline. A breeze carried the scent of pine and rain. Elaine sipped from her mug. You ever think about how close we came to losing him? Frank nodded. Every day. But we didn't. No. She set the mug down, leaned forward. So now what? Frank looked out across the field. Now, we make sure they never do. It again. He didn't mean just to Ranger. He meant the others, because the world had a short memory for what it broke, but not everyone had forgotten. The ranch was quiet again. Spring had begun to spread across the fields, softening the hard lines of winter, filling the pastures with pale green and the air with the scent of damp earth. The porch boards creaked under Frank's boots as he walked out with a cup of coffee. In hand, steam curling upward into the early light. Ranger was already at his usual spot near the steps, head resting between his paws, eyes half-lidded but alert. Bravo dozed nearby, stretched long in the sun. Inside, Elaine was reading the draft. Aloud, her voice even but warm. Frank leaned against the railing, listening to her finish the last paragraph of what would be the book's epilogue. It had taken months. compiling reports, building the timeline, giving names to shadows. But now, it was real. The story was no longer just theirs to carry. The manuscript's title was simple. Every family rejected him. It was Ranger's story, but not just his. It was the story of all the others too, those who had been built for violence, then left behind. Those who had served without question, who had endured beyond the mission. Elaine stepped onto the porch and handed Frank a worn envelope. The publisher's check. He barely glanced at it. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. "Send it back," he said. "Or forward, I guess. There's a rehab facility in Virginia, one for retired K-9s. Quiet place, needs funding." Elaine smiled. He'd like that. Ranger's ears flicked, but he didn't lift his head. That afternoon, Frank drove into town. Not because he wanted to, but because the sheriff had asked. A local paper wanted a photo, something for the community board. There was a ceremony planned, a small one, for the library's veterans' wall. They were adding a new section, not for men, not for battles, for dogs. He didn't stay long. He stood for the photo, shook a few hands. When someone asked him to speak, he gave them a single sentence. He wasn't trained to love, but he did it anyway. Back at the ranch, Ranger was waiting at the gate. Frank opened it slow and let the truck roll in. The dog stepped aside, then trotted after him toward the barn. Frank didn't call, didn't need to. The sun was low when he walked out to the field, rifle in hand. Just routine now. Habit. He made the loop past the outer fence, checked the cameras. The lights. They hadn't been triggered in months, but the tripwire stayed. On the hilltop, he stopped and looked out across the valley. Distant barks echoed from the trees. Ranger, from somewhere below. Low. Just tired? Resigned? Where? Frank asked. Arizona. Private facility outside Tucson. Off the grid, but not for long. They left the next morning. The drive south was hotter, drier, quieter. They stopped only for gas and water. By the time they reached the edge of the facility's surveillance range, the sun was already low. The perimeter was surrounded by chain link and motion lights. No signs, no guards visible. But Elaine confirmed activity from her signal scanner. Drones, wireless cameras, encrypted radios. Frank parked a half-mile out. They approached on foot. Ranger led the way. Through a broken fence near the drainage ditch, they slipped onto the property. The buildings were low, flat-roofed, steel and concrete. Elaine stayed outside to monitor signals while Frank moved inside. He didn't carry a weapon, just a key card from the lockbox and a flashlight covered in red tape. Inside, the air was thick with ammonia and something worse, fear. He passed empty kennels, a medical bay with restraints bolted to the floor, shelves of chemicals labeled only by codes. And then, behind a rusted door, he found the dogs, 3 pens. The first was empty. The second held a brown shepherd with its back turned, barely breathing. The third, Bravo 9, stood and locked eyes with Frank. No growl, no step forward, just stillness. Frank crouched low and held his hand to the mesh. "It's over," he said. "You're not alone." Ranger appeared in the doorway, and that's when the change happened. Bravo 9's ears shifted. His body relaxed just slightly. His eyes flicked from Frank to Ranger and back again. Recognition. Frank opened the gate. Bravo didn't rush out. He stepped forward slowly, carefully, sniffed Ranger's shoulder, then lowered his head. Outside, Elaine called. Over the comm. "We've got movement, 2 vehicles inbound." Frank looked at the dog. "Can you run?" Bravo didn't hesitate. They moved fast, Ranger in the lead, Bravo following, Frank just behind. They made it out the same way they came in, ducking, beneath the broken fence and into the scrub. Elaine waited with the truck already running. No time for questions, no time for thanks. By nightfall, they were 3 dogs again. 1 new, 2 known. Frank watched them from the tailgate, Ranger resting. Beside Bravo, both dogs breathing steady in the cool desert air. Elaine sat nearby, tapping at the laptop, already erasing traces of their path. "They'll come after us," she said. "They already were." Frank reached down and ran his fingers through Ranger's fur, then over to Bravo's neck. The dog flinched but didn't pull away. "They made them for war," Frank said. "But they're not just weapons." Elaine looked over. "No, they're survivors." And now they weren't surviving alone. Washington, D.C. was a city of monuments. Marble figures lined the National Mall like sentinels, each one carved from history and memory, standing tall against the hum of traffic and politics. But today, a new figure was being added, not cast in stone, but in bronze. Not a president, not a general, but a dog. Frank stood near the back of the crowd, his hands in the pockets of his worn coat. The Capitol dome loomed in the distance, white against the dull sky. A chill ran through the spring air, more wind than cold. Elaine stood beside him, shoulders square, her expression composed, but her fingers tugged at the cuff of her sleeve. Every few seconds, Ranger sat between them, still and observant. Bravo rested farther back under the shade of a tree, head on his paws, his leash loosely tied to a bench. The statue was modest, just over life-size, positioned in a low garden, where schoolchildren could walk right up and touch it. Ranger had stood for the mold months earlier. They hadn't known how to pose him at first. Sitting felt too tame, barking too aggressive. So they'd captured him in a quiet stance, standing, ears forward, as if hearing something no one else. Good? At the base of the bronze, a plaque had been carved. He was made for war, but he chose to heal. There were no microphones, no speeches. The event wasn't listed on any schedule, but the people who needed to be there had shown up. Veterans, handlers, families of dogs that hadn't come home. A few senators in plain suits lingered at the edges. No cameras, not this time. Frank watched the crowd from behind his sunglasses, letting the moment settle in. It felt strange, right, but strange. Elaine exhaled, her breath sharp. Close enough to reach the main house on foot, far enough to feel like her own space. She kept mostly to herself, working long hours in front of a battered laptop, compiling files, old communications, names. She didn't say it aloud, but Frank knew what she was doing, tracking the rest of them, the other dogs. The program hadn't stopped with Ranger. That was clear now. It was early evening when the call came from Texas. Frank answered, expecting another spam dial or a wrong number. Instead, the voice on the other end was raw, hushed. "There's one more," the man said. "Down here. Amarillo. Oh, shelter. They took him last night." Frank stood still, the floor cold under his bare feet. "Who took him?" "Don't know. Black SUV, government plates. No badge, no warrant. They just showed up, said he was property. Dog's name was Bishop, real quiet, never caused trouble, until he started growling at helicopters." Frank's hand clenched the phone tighter. "You're not the only ones on their radar," the man said. "Watch yourself." The line went dead. Frank didn't tell Elaine that night. Not yet. She looked tired. She was doing enough, but the weight in his chest returned. The same heaviness he'd carried in war zones, waiting for a convoy that might never come. Waiting for an order that made no sense. The next morning, he found footprints at the bottom of the south fence line. Not fresh, not obvious, but there. One of the tripwires had been cut, not triggered, just clipped. Whoever had been there knew what to look for. He didn't say anything, just repaired the line and reset the alarm. That night, someone left a dead bird on the porch. Not mangled, just placed. Frank picked it up without a word and buried it near the barn. It wasn't until the next day that the real message came. Ranger paced the house in the early afternoon, unsettled. Frank followed him to the back door, where a smudge of red had been sprayed on the wall. The paint was fresh, still sticky. 4 words again, but not the same ones carved into the barn weeks ago. "You're not done yet." Frank stood there a long time. Elaine saw it when she came over that evening. "They're watching," she said. "I know. They're testing the ground waiting for us to relax. Frank looked toward the ridge, where the light was starting to fade. Then we don't relax. Elaine handed him a list. Names, locations, coordinates. She had narrowed the remaining dogs to 3. One was likely gone. One was Bishop. The last, unknown. They're not just covering their tracks anymore, she said. They're trying to rebuild. Frank sat at the table, running his hand over the edges of the list. They're still trying to get it right, she nodded. And if they do, next time they won't stop with one dog. Ranger sat beside the door, staring out at the fading. Son, still, alert. Frank looked down at the note again. Not done yet. He folded the list and tucked it into his pocket. Then we don't let them finish what they started. The truck rolled west before sunrise, headlights slicing through the morning fog that blanketed the Montana plains. Frank drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely over a printed map folded 3 times too many. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, ears twitching with each bump in the road. Elaine rode in the back seat with her laptop open, a series of coordinates glowing faintly on the screen. They hadn't spoken much since leaving the house. The silence between them wasn't cold, it was focused. They reached the safe house in Colorado just after dusk the following day. It was a farmhouse like Frank's, but long abandoned, its windows boarded and the barn half collapsed. It didn't look like a place where anything still lived. But it had heat, a roof, and more importantly, information. The contact Elaine had spoken with wasn't there, but what he'd left behind was. Inside a metal lockbox buried beneath the floorboards, they found surveillance footage, grainy images pulled from stolen feeds, shelter pens, concrete kennels, handlers in black uniforms moving with practiced indifference. 3 dogs were marked. One matched Bishop. The second, they didn't know. The third made Frank go still. The ears, the eyes. The scar across the muzzle, another Ember dog. Elaine zoomed in, voice low. This one was listed as Bravo 9. Same imprinting patterns as Ranger. Same exposure to the override loops. Frank stared at the screen. The dog didn't look hostile. Footage from the drones, medical logs, after-action reports. Together, it looked less like a theory and more like a confession signed in blood. Frank checked the perimeter one more time. Every camera still worked. The lights would trigger at the edge of the fence line. The shotgun was clean and close, but this wasn't about holding them off anymore. It was about telling the story before the silence swallowed it again. Elaine finished copying the last drive and passed one to Frank. You sure about the reporter? Frank nodded. She's real. She's been burned before by the DOD. She's not going to blink at this. Elaine leaned back in the chair. When they find out it was you who leaked it, they'll come. They already did. Frank walked into the kitchen and picked up the phone. It was a satellite line, old but secure. He dialed a number. 1 ring, 2. A woman's voice answered. You still interested in stories that get people killed? Only if they're true, she said. Frank didn't bother with introductions. I'm sending you a package, 3 drives. Everything about Project Ember, Operation Wild Iron, and the dog they didn't want anyone to find. There was a pause. Who are you? Just someone tired of watching good things get buried? He gave her the drop coordinates and hung up. Elaine watched him from across the room. You're really going to do it. Frank sat down and rubbed his eyes. It's not about me. Later that afternoon, they drove an old pickup to the county line and left the envelope taped inside a rusted mailbox on a service road. It would be gone by nightfall. 2 other copies were dropped at post offices 2 counties over. One went straight to a congressional oversight office in D.C., the other to a military watchdog group known for naming names. By the time the sun dipped low, it was out of their hands. The fallout began the next morning. It started small, an anonymous upload, to a whistleblower site. Then came the forums, the dark corners of veteran networks lighting up with recognition. Former handlers, retired MPs, techs who remembered dogs that didn't come home. Within hours, it was everywhere. The tags, the command notes, video footage of Ranger running drills in conditions no animal should have survived. And then the interviews. started. Elaine did the first one, her voice quiet but unshaken. She didn't name names. She didn't need to. The story did that for her. Frank watched from the porch, the sound low, Ranger lying at his feet. When the reporter asked why she disappeared, Elaine's answer was simple. Because I saw what they were becoming. The congressional inquiry came next. A statement from the Department of Defense followed within days, denying knowledge, distancing themselves from the people responsible. But it was too late. The name Project Ember was already burned into public memory. Protests gathered outside federal buildings. Demands for accountability followed. And through it all, one image kept showing up in news segments and articles. A dog sitting beside a worn wooden fence. Eyes sharp, still as stone. Ranger had become a symbol. Frank didn't like it. He wasn't made for spotlights. But he let it happen because sometimes symbols mattered more than silence. Sometimes the truth had to hurt before it healed. That night, Frank stood at the gate and looked out at the road. No lights, no engine sounds, just wind and peace that didn't feel permanent. Elaine joined him, her arms crossed tight against the cold. They'll come again, Frank nodded. Probably. But not like before. He looked at her. No, this time they know we're not afraid. She looked down at Ranger, who sat between them, breathing slow, calm. They wanted him forgotten, she said. Frank ran a hand over the dog's back. Then they picked the wrong house. The ceremony was held under a pale morning sky, outside the Capitol building, where the flag hung still and the cameras were already humming before the first name was called. Frank stood off to the side, away from the crowd, his suit borrowed, his posture stiff with discomfort. The sling was gone now, so were the bruises, but something deeper in him had stayed sore. Beside him, Ranger sat perfectly still, black coat brushed clean, silver hairs now showing more at his chin and chest. He wore no muzzle, no collar, only a dark ribbon around his neck with the medal resting just beneath it, bronze polished, stamped with the seal of the Department of Defense and the words, "Service Beyond Duty." It was the first medal ever issued to a classified K-9. Elaine stood on the other side, her expression unreadable as she scanned the rows of folding chairs. And the faces of senators, aides, reporters. Most of them looked eager. Some looked uneasy. A man in a press suit approached the microphone and cleared his throat. His voice was practiced, solemn. Today we honor a veteran whose record was hidden for too long. One who served without question, endured what no animal ever should have, and emerged not just intact, but loyal. There was polite applause. The words sounded clean, neatly prepared, sanitized. But Frank wasn't listening to the speech. His eyes were on Ranger, who sat without flinching, without blinking, his gaze forward. The man continued. This medal represents more than service. It represents sacrifice. And today it belongs to Ranger, 77th Infantry, Operation Wild Iron. May history remember what we almost lost. A military aide stepped forward and fastened the medal gently to the ribbon around Ranger's neck. There was a beat of silence, then applause, louder this time. Cameras flashed, reporters took notes, but Ranger didn't move. Frank leaned down, whispered near his ear, "That's for you, buddy." Ranger turned slightly, and for the first time all morning his eyes met Frank's, and something softened. After the ceremony, they avoided the press line. Elaine kept walking. Frank followed. Ranger stayed between them, tail low, steps measured. Once they reached the sidewalk, the crowds thinned. No questions, no photos, just city air and the sound of their boots on pavement. Elaine exhaled slowly. They made it look clean. "It never is," Frank replied. "Still," she added, "it means something that the truth came out, that he got to stand in front of them and they had to look at him." Frank nodded, watching Ranger as the dog sniffed the curb, ears twitching. At a nearby siren. "I don't think he cared about the medal," Frank said. "He didn't need to," Elaine answered. "It wasn't for him." They returned to the farmhouse that evening. The sky above Montana stretched wide again, open and quiet. Frank stepped out of the truck, stiff from the drive, and opened the passenger door. Ranger hopped down, slower. than he used to, but steady. As Frank walked toward the porch, he noticed the note on the front door, tucked under a stone. Not handwritten this time, typed. No signature. Not all of us wanted this to go public. Frank folded the paper slowly, tucked it into his pocket. The message wasn't a surprise. The silence after the storm never meant peace. It just meant the next wave would be smarter. Inside, Elaine made tea. Frank stood at the window and stared into the night. Ranger lay at the foot of the couch, watching nothing in particular. Frank pulled the medal from around the dog's neck and set it gently. "On the mantel. You already earned it," he said. "No reason to keep carrying it." The phone rang that night long after dark. Frank picked up, said nothing. A voice on the other end, one he didn't know, spoke low. "This doesn't end with a ceremony. You've stirred something bigger than just one dog." Frank listened. "They'll come looking again for the others." He hung up without replying. The house stayed still. But Frank no longer expected silence to last. He walked into the living room, sat down beside Ranger, and rested his hand on the dog's back. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Slow, steady. They had survived the first fight. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Frank kept the folded note in the top drawer of his desk. He didn't look at it often, but he never forgot it was there. The threat wasn't loud anymore. It was quiet, and quiet threats were the ones that lingered. The medal on the mantel gathered dust, untouched since the day it was hung. Ranger hadn't looked at it once. Neither had Frank. The town had returned to normal on the surface, but the silence had weight now. People nodded to Frank at the feed. Store, but didn't talk. They watched Ranger from a distance, some with curiosity, others with the quiet edge of fear. Frank noticed the way shopkeepers locked their doors a little faster when he walked by. The way the sheriff looked over his shoulder before offering a tight-lipped hello. Elaine had moved into the small cabin by the ridge. "You want a war, you just got it." The man in the tactical jacket stepped forward once more, slower this time. "We'll be back," he said. Frank didn't blink. "I'll be waiting." The men retreated to their vehicles, dragging their wounded, leaving behind only blood, crushed grass, and silence. Frank stood there until the tail lights vanished beyond the ridge. Then he walked back into the house. A smear of red painted the doorframe. Ranger followed, limping slightly, but without hesitation. Frank knelt beside him, checked the leg. A graze, nothing deep. The dog leaned against him, eyes dull with fatigue but still alert. "You did good," Frank whispered. He poured water, cleaned the cut, bandaged it as best he could. Outside, the wind picked up again, but this time it didn't carry just a cold. It carried a message. They weren't here to scare him. They were here to erase the past. And now, the past had teeth. Frank woke before dawn, still sitting in the corner of the living room with the shotgun leaning against his knee. The house smelled of smoke and gun oil. The air was thick with dust and silence. The walls bore new scars, splintered wood, bullet holes near the windows, glass shards on the floor. Outside, the early light crept slowly over the bloodied porch. Steps. Ranger stirred beside him, lifting his head with effort. The bandage on his leg held firm. The limp was still there, but it hadn't stopped him from pacing half the night. Every time Frank closed his eyes, Ranger was at another window, watching the tree line. They hadn't spoken since the shooting. Stopped. Words didn't seem necessary anymore. Frank made coffee, slow and mechanical. He added wood to the fire, patched what he could of the broken doorframe. The ground was drying outside, leaving behind boot prints and blood. He followed the trail down the back path where one of the bodies had been dragged. Nothing was left now but trampled weeds and empty brass. Whoever had come for Ranger hadn't just been testing defenses. They'd meant to kill him, and Frank, he sat on the edge of the porch, watching the horizon. His shoulder ached where a round had grazed him in the fight. He hadn't even noticed it until Ranger had pushed his head into Frank's ribs and whined low, blood wetting the man's shirt. The pain had come later. Frank rolled his sleeve and checked the wound. Clean enough, shallow, a burn more than a break. He taped it shut and drank the rest of the coffee with his jaw tight. Before noon, a truck pulled up at the gate. Frank stood, shotgun in hand. It wasn't Cole or Dent this time. The man who stepped out looked younger, but his eyes weren't. He didn't wear body armor or tactical black, just jeans, a faded army jacket, and a badge clipped to his belt that didn't belong to any department Frank recognized. "I'm not here to fight," the man called. "Name's Dawson. I was with Ember, too." Frank didn't lower the gun. "You part of the team that came last night?" "No, but I know who was." Frank nodded slowly. "Then you know I'm not handing the dog over." Dawson stepped closer, hands empty. "They won't stop. Not because of the program, because of what he knows. They did more than obedience work. They tested response memory, put dogs in blackout situations, made them act on pure conditioning. That dog didn't just serve, he survived." Frank kept his eyes on him. "Why are you here?" Dawson pulled something from his jacket, an old photo, a group shot, uniforms, dust, a kennel in the background. Frank recognized the woman standing in the center, Elaine Rowe. "She's alive," Dawson said. "Off-grid. Disappeared after the trials. They told her he died in the desert." Frank stepped off the porch. "She asked me to find out if the rumors were true. She thinks about him every day. Blames herself." Frank looked at the picture again, then at Ranger, who sat by the porch watching the stranger with quiet intensity. "She know they're trying to kill him?" Frank asked. "She suspects, but she's not the only one they're watching." Dawson looked up the road, then back at Frank. "I'd get ready if I were you. Last night was a warning shot. The next won't be." He handed Frank a slip of paper. "A location, a name." Then he turned and walked back to his truck without another word. That night, Frank took Ranger out to the pasture and walked the perimeter again. They didn't talk. They didn't stop. When the stars came out, Frank stopped beneath the tall oak at the edge of the ridge. He looked out at the hills, where headlights had flickered days before, and whispered just loud enough for the wind to carry it. "They want a war." Ranger didn't bark. He just leaned forward slightly, his body alert, and waited. Frank reached down and placed a hand on his head. "Then we give them one." The hospital smelled like bleach and old linen, too clean for a place where pain lived in every hallway. Frank sat in the corner of a private room with one arm in a sling and a bandage wrapped around his ribs. Ranger lay on the floor beside him, his eyes half closed but never fully asleep. The nurse had tried to keep the dog out. Frank hadn't argued. He just opened the door and waited. Ranger came in anyway, lay down, and refused to leave. No one tried again. Outside, rain streaked the windows. The sound was soft, steady, like breath against the glass. Frank hadn't said much since the police had cleared the scene at his property. 4 bodies, no IDs, no affiliations. The report said nothing. The deputies asked questions but didn't press too hard. No one wanted to tangle with federal shadows. He didn't tell them about the file, or the drone, or the men who hadn't come back. The sheriff's office gave him a nod, a warning, and a stack of paperwork, but nobody told him to stop watching his back. Then the door opened. Frank looked up. The woman standing there was older than the photo. Dawson had left, but not by much. Her hair was grey now, tied back in a low knot, but her eyes were still sharp. Still steel. She didn't speak at first, just looked at him. Then her eyes dropped to the dog. Ranger lifted his head. He didn't growl, didn't bark. He stood slowly, walked to her, and stopped a few inches away. The tension in his body was still there, but something else bloomed beneath it. Hesitation, recognition. Elaine Rowe knelt to the floor, her hands shaking. "Hey, boy," she whispered. Ranger stepped forward, almost uncertain. Then he pressed his head into her chest and stayed there. Frank looked away. Elaine didn't cry, but the silence between them stretched so long and thick it might as well have been sobbing. Ranger made a sound that Frank had never heard before. A low, guttural whimper. Not pain, not fear, grief. Elaine held him for a long time before speaking. "I thought he was dead." "They said the same about you," Frank said. She nodded, brushing her hand down Ranger's back. They told me he didn't survive the collapse of the compound. They gave me a medal and reassigned me to desk work. I left 6 months later, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop hearing the recordings they played in the debriefings, dogs screaming, men lying. They used him, Frank said, turned him into something they couldn't control. Elaine met his eyes. He fought it. He still is. She stood, legs stiff, and walked to the window. They're not done. You know that, don't you? Once they know I made contact, they'll come harder. They can't let it leak. Not what they did, not what they turned those dogs into. Frank nodded. Then we hit first. Elaine turned, surprised by the calm in his voice. We've got the files, Frank added. Everything, logs, orders, behavioral data, enough to make it stick. The world doesn't know who Ranger is, but they will. You'll never get it out in time, she said. They'll bury it in red tape. You'll disappear before the ink dries. Then we send it everywhere at once. Elaine studied him for a moment. You're serious? I've had men die for less than this. I'm not letting them erase. Him. Or you. A long pause stretched between them. Then she smiled, faint but real. I never thought anyone would care. I didn't either, Frank said. But here we are. She sat down beside the dog again, her hand resting on his shoulder. Ranger closed his eyes. Frank looked at both of them, the woman who raised the dog from nothing, and the animal who had survived the worst of what man could build. I think we've got one last fight in us, he said. Elaine looked up. Then let's make it count. The living room table was covered in documents. Ranger lay near the fireplace, resting his chin on his paws, his eyes following every movement Frank made. Elaine sat beside the open laptop, her fingers moving, fast, copying data onto 3 flash drives. The file Frank had hidden beneath the floorboards was now spread wide. Classified orders. Frank turned on the field radio, static crackling through the speaker. He adjusted the dial slowly, searching for something, anything. On a low band, he caught a voice. Target confirmed. Location remains stable. Second team en route. Turned it off. They were coming. He walked out to the porch with a cigarette he hadn't meant to smoke and leaned against the rail. The stars were out, cold and bright. You ready for this? He asked softly. Ranger sat beside him, ears tilted back, eyes scanning the dark. Neither of them needed to speak. They just were. Inside, Frank stared at the folder one last time before tucking it into a fireproof box and locking it beneath the floor. Then he sat in the old armchair by the window and rested the shotgun across his lap again. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, the war would start. And this time, he wouldn't be the one running from it. The first sign came just after midnight. The wind had died, leaving the night heavy and breathless. A low hum carried over the ridge, followed by the distant crunch of tires on gravel. Frank didn't move from the chair. He listened, counted the seconds between the sounds. 5 vehicles, maybe 6. No headlights, no engine revs, just the sound of quiet professionals doing something they'd done before. Ranger stood in the hallway, body low, ears flat, head turned slightly as if to confirm what Frank already knew. They were here. Frank rose and walked to the door. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He flipped the switch on the wall and watched as the perimeter lights flared to life. A second later, motion sensors caught shapes moving at the far end. Of the field, just shadows against the floodlight wash, but moving wrong, like men who didn't belong here. He picked up the field radio and keyed the mic. Grid clear, perimeter lit. First contact confirmed. There was no answer. He hadn't expected one. The only one listening was already at his side. Ranger pressed forward to the door, tail stiff, nose high. Frank opened it just wide enough for the dog to slip through. He watched as the black figure moved through the open yard like a ghost, silent. Sure. Ranger took position behind the woodpile, eyes on the road. Frank stepped out next, shotgun in hand, moving slow, deliberate, every step practiced. The SUVs came into view one by one, engines low, lights still dark. They stopped just short of the gate. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened. A man stepped out in a tactical jacket and jeans, his hand resting on a radio at his shoulder. Another emerged from the passenger side, holding a flashlight pointed toward the... He ground. Frank raised the shotgun. "You're trespassing," he called out. The lead man didn't flinch. He raised his empty hands. "Mr. Holloway, we just want the dog." Frank didn't move. "No one has to get hurt," the man continued. "But if you don't give him up, people will." Ranger growled from the shadows. "You don't want this?" Frank said. The man smirked. "You think this is some kind of standoff? It's not. This isn't personal. This is cleanup." Frank's finger brushed the trigger, then everything exploded. A second vehicle at the rear kicked on its lights, flooding the back pasture. Men in black moved fast. 3 on foot, one with a drone controller in hand. Frank fired first, the echo rolling across the field like thunder. The first man dropped. The others scattered, but not fast enough. Ranger lunged from behind the woodpile, hitting one low, driving him to the dirt. Frank moved back toward the house, firing once more before ducking behind the porch wall. Bullets snapped against the wood. Glass shattered inside. The farmhouse lights went out. Power cut. He cursed and moved to the side window, checking the tree line. 2 more figures flanked left, trying to circle toward the barn. Frank keyed the secondary breaker. Another set of motion lights flicked on, catching them in pale yellow light. One retreated. The other hesitated. Frank didn't. The man dropped before he could raise his weapon. Inside the house, the drone from the night before activated again, smaller, faster this time, sweeping low across the yard. Ranger barked once, a deep warning sound, and leapt. His jaws caught it mid-air. The device crashed into the dirt in a burst of sparks. Then, silence, not calm, just pause. Frank stood in the doorway again, shotgun lowered but ready. "Last chance," he called. But the ink had already blurred. The name at the top was Elaine Rowe. There were notes about her, too. How she'd fought against the changes, how she'd petitioned for Ranger's retirement, how she'd gone above her chain of command and vanished. Shortly after, the last line in her record simply read, "Location redacted, status off-grid." Frank stared at the words until they swam. He looked over at Ranger. "You remember her, don't you?" he asked. The dog didn't move, but something in his eyes changed. Just a flicker. Recognition. Grief. "She didn't give up on you," Frank said. "They erased her because she didn't follow the script." Outside, the wind picked up. The trees bent slightly at the edge of the field. A familiar weight pressed down on the air. Frank started gathering the pages. He slid them into a folder, taped it shut, and tucked it under the floorboard near the fireplace, where he used to hide his service pistol. He didn't know why. Instinct, maybe. Or the certainty that things were going to get worse. That night, while checking the barn, he found something new, a drone, small, silent, still running when he found it wedged near the rafters. Its red light blinked softly in the dark, recording. Watching. Listening. Frank crushed it under his boot, metal snapping beneath the weight. He didn't tell Ranger, but he didn't have to. The dog already knew. Frank didn't sleep that night. Not really. He dozed in the chair by the front door, with the shotgun resting across his lap and one eye on the window. Ranger lay nearby, facing the opposite direction, back to the wall, guarding the rest of the house like a soldier watching. For movement through fog, neither of them said a word. They just listened. To the wind, to the creak of wood settling, to the weight of what was coming. By morning, Frank had made up his mind. He moved through the house with purpose, every motion calculated. First he boarded the broken barn window, then reinforced the locks on the doors. In the old cellar beneath the kitchen, he found the case he hadn't opened since his discharge. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 2 more weapons, a dozen rounds of 12-gauge and a field radio. He laid it all out on the counter, inventorying each piece with the steady hands of a man who had built a life, trying to forget everything he now needed to remember. Outside, he strung wire through the tree line. It wasn't perfect, but it would. Trip someone if they weren't careful. At the south fence, he buried 2 pressure sensors he'd ordered years ago and never installed. He set up motion lights on the porch and mounted cameras near the gateposts. Ranger followed him through. Every step, silent and alert, responding to gestures more than words. It was like slipping back into a language they both had once known, but hadn't spoken in years. By noon, the house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a post. Frank went inside and sat with a notepad. He began writing commands. Short, sharp phrases from the training manual, the kind burned into his brain. Then he whistled softly and called Ranger to him. "Sit," he said. Ranger obeyed. "Scan." Ranger turned his head left, then right, then back to Frank. The same motion. He had performed 100 times while clearing buildings overseas. Hold. The dog froze in place, unblinking. Frank nodded, lips pressed together. He tried another one buried deeper. 5-0, he said. Ranger hesitated. Then he lowered to the ground, rolled to his side, and lay still, feigning death. Frank closed the notebook. They had trained him beyond obedience. They had programmed him, but the dog still remembered, still responded, and that was both hope and warning. That afternoon, Frank stood at the edge of the property line with his binoculars. Down the road, a figure stood near the highway shoulder, just watching. No vehicle, no movement. The moment Frank lifted the lenses, the figure turned and walked away into the trees. He didn't follow, not yet. When the sun went down, the wind picked up. The temperature dropped quick, and the stillness that settled over the land didn't feel like peace. It felt like breath held too long. Frank made coffee, dark and thick, and sat at the kitchen table with the lights off. Ranger stood near the fireplace, then paced the hallway, then returned to the door. Every step was exact, every pause meaningful. They were waiting. Both of them. Later, not growling, not moving, just present. Frank said the name aloud for the first time. Elaine Rowe. Ranger's eyes narrowed just slightly. She had been the original handler. He remembered her now, clearer with each passing day. She wasn't. The type to vanish without reason. She'd stayed behind after Wild Iron collapsed, stayed on base when the others rotated out. Then she'd gone quiet. No forwarding address, no phone number. Just disappeared into the silence the military liked to keep over its mistakes. Frank pulled an old landline off the wall and dialed another number. An old friend, a man who still had access to places Frank couldn't reach anymore. "I need a location," he said when the man answered. "For Captain Elaine Rowe, retired." A pause. "You looking to get into trouble, Holloway?" "Already there." He gave the last 4 digits on the service record. The man whistled softly on the other end. "I'll call you back." He hung up. Frank stood and looked out the window toward the barn. The wind was pushing hard against the grass. Ranger was still there, guarding. That night, the quiet snapped. It was just past 2 in the morning when Frank woke to a sound he didn't recognize, at least not immediately. A faint metallic rattle, like something brushing against the side of the barn, then a scrape, then a single low growl from outside. Frank grabbed the shotgun by instinct, slipping on his boots, his heart already moving before his feet hit the floor. He stepped onto the porch. Ranger was at the far end of the yard, crouched low, body stiff as iron, staring into the dark. Frank followed his gaze. Someone had been there, not long gone either. Frank found the marks himself, a set of footprints, pressed into the mud along the barn's north wall. Too clean to be accidental, too fresh to be old, and carved into the wood, deep, deliberate, ugly, were 4 words. "Monsters don't belong here." Frank stood over the carving for a long time, the shotgun at his side, the wind snapping at his jacket. He didn't call the police. He didn't report it. He just walked back to the house, stood in the kitchen, and watched Ranger lie down near the fireplace without closing his eyes. There wasn't going to be peace. Not now. But there would be answers, and Frank Holloway had run from enough ghosts in his life. Frank heard the truck before he saw it. A heavy engine, diesel-fed, moving slow up the gravel road like it didn't care about the dust it kicked up or the sound it made. It wasn't local, not the way the wheels rolled or the way the idle held too long before cutting off. He stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag, and squinted toward the gate. 2 men stepped out. They weren't wearing uniforms, but they might as well have been. The posture gave them away. Shoulders too square, steps too even. The kind of deliberate stillness you only learned in the field. Not soldiers, contractors, government ghosts. Frank said nothing. One of them smiled, the kind of smile that belonged in a poker game or a warning. "Mr. Holloway," the shorter one said, "we heard you've got something that doesn't belong to you." Frank didn't answer. Ranger stood in the doorway behind him, silent but upright, his eyes locked on the visitors. His body didn't twitch, but Frank could feel the tension roll off him like heat. The taller man glanced at the dog. "Name's Cole. My partner here is Dent. We worked with Ember, overseas." Frank didn't move. That program was shut down. Dent chuckled. "Yeah, funny thing about programs. Some of them never really end. They just get new names." Frank crossed his arms. "You drove all the way out here to tell me that?" Cole stepped closer, boots crunching the gravel. "We came to take him back. The dog. He was part of classified work, federal property." Frank shook his head. "That tag said do not separate." "You already did." Dent's smile faded. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. He's not just a dog. He was conditioned, neurologically, not just trained, modified. And it didn't all go according to plan." Frank narrowed his eyes. "He seems pretty damn steady to me now," Cole said, "but that doesn't mean it'll last." Frank felt his jaw clench. Dent pulled a file from the truck and dropped it onto the porch step. It landed with a soft thud. "Read it. You'll see that animal's not a survivor. He's a weapon they tried to perfect, and when it didn't work, they erased it. You think you're helping him, but he's remembering who he was." Ranger let out a low growl. It was quiet, controlled, but unmistakable. Cole raised his hands. "We're not here to make trouble, but we will be back, and next time we won't be asking nicely." The 2 men climbed back into the truck. The engine roared back to life, and within seconds they were gone down the road, a fresh cloud of dirt trailing behind them like an open wound. Frank didn't touch the file at first. He just stood there. Then slowly he knelt and opened it. Inside were photos, grainy black and whites from what looked like a compound in the desert. Dogs, lean and hungry-eyed, strapped into odd rigs. Ranger was in several of them, muzzle on, body wrapped in wires. One shot showed him lunging through smoke at a target dummy shaped like a man. Frank closed the folder before he got through the rest. Inside the house, Ranger sat in the center of the room, not by the door this time, just watching Frank, unmoving. Frank met his eyes. "They think you're a weapon," he said softly. "That's why they're scared, not because of what you've done, but what they did to you." He looked down at the folder again. "I'd be scared too." That night, Frank locked every door and moved his shotgun beside the bed. Ranger didn't sleep. He sat near the window, ears up, body still. Twice he stood and paced to the back door, then back to the front. The 3rd time he stopped. Frank sat up in the dark. "What is it?" Ranger turned his head. A vehicle passed the ridge. No lights, no sound, but Ranger heard it, felt it. His ears pinned back, and he crouched low, eyes focused on a place beyond the glass. Frank walked to the window and looked out. Nothing but shadows and grass, but something was out there, and it wasn't done with them. Frank waited until morning to call Henry. He was an old friend, one of the last he trusted. They'd served together once, long ago, in a place most people couldn't find on a map and didn't want to. These days, Henry worked with records down at the VA in Missoula. Quiet desk job, deep clearance. Just enough reach to dig where others wouldn't. "I need access to any declassified Ember files," Frank said without greeting. "And anything they tried to bury along with it." A pause. "You sure you want to go down that road, Frank?" Frank. looked out the window at Ranger, who was still posted at the fence line like he hadn't moved all night. "I'm already on it," Henry sighed. "Give me a couple hours." Frank hung up. He spent the morning in the barn, not working, just thinking. Ranger followed him out but didn't stray far. Every few minutes the dog would stop, ears turning toward the trees, nose twitching like something still lingered out there. Maybe it did. By the time the call came through, Frank was sitting at the workbench with a wrench in his hand and a mind full of questions. "You didn't hear this from me," Henry said, his voice tight, "but I found something." The file came in pieces, scanned pages, fragments of reports, internal memos with entire paragraphs blacked out. Frank printed them all one by one and spread them across the kitchen table. Ranger sat nearby, quiet as ever, but his eyes never left the paper. The documents painted a story Frank hadn't expected. Operation Wild Iron was never just about reconnaissance or standard K9 units. It had been a testbed for something darker. Project Ember, a defense-funded program designed to enhance obedience through neurochemical alteration. Dogs were implanted with microstim devices tied to external command systems. The idea was to reduce hesitation, amplify aggression when needed, and remove moral instinct. They didn't just train the dogs, they rewired them. According to the logs, Ranger had been one of the first and one of the last. He'd shown unexpected resistance to behavioral override, one memo read. Strong bond with primary handler remains unbroken. Attempts to sever have led to erratic behavior. Recommend termination. Frank gritted his teeth as he read. There were after-action reports too, ones that described Ranger engaging threats with surgical precision, but also moments where he froze under stress, disobeyed direct commands, refused to attack. Too human, someone had scribbled in the margins. Frank didn't realize he was shaking until the coffee cup in his hand tipped, spilling cold liquid across a photo. He cursed, grabbed a towel. Someone whispered, "That's the dog from the shelter." Another said, "They shouldn't have let him out." The deputy's voice cut through. "I need you to step away from the animal." Frank didn't move. "You pull that gun, and you're gonna scare everyone here worse than he ever could." Reese glanced at the crowd, then slowly lowered his hand. "Take him home," he said. "Now, before someone decides to make this worse." Frank nodded once. He turned, leash still slack, and walked away. Ranger followed, calm, quiet, but the tension hadn't left his body. By the time they got home, the video was already online. Frank sat at the kitchen table, phone in hand, watching the shaky footage. A little girl approaching, a frozen dog, a deputy stepping forward. The captions were worse than the clip. "War dog snaps at parade. Shelter should never have released this animal. Who's protecting the town?" Frank shut the phone off and tossed it across the table. By nightfall, the shelter that had released Ranger issued a statement. Words like "reviewing adoption protocols" and "regret any distress" filled the screen. Frank didn't sleep. Ranger didn't leave the front door. The next morning, a letter arrived, nailed to the fence. No stamp, no envelope, just a single phrase scratched in thick, angry ink. "Not welcome." Frank pulled it down and stared at it for a long while. He burned it in the fire pit without a word. Later that day, a call came from a number Frank didn't recognize. A voice answered. Quiet, apologetic. It was Maggie, the girl from the shelter. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said. "They're blaming you, but it's not fair." Frank didn't reply. "They shut the shelter down," she added. "People are scared, and when people get scared, they go looking for someone to blame." Frank hung up. That night, as the wind kicked through the grass and the moon rose over the ridgeline, Frank sat on the porch steps with Ranger at his feet. He watched the shadows stretch across the field and listened for movement, for footsteps, for headlights. Because war didn't always come in uniforms and trucks. Sometimes it came in silence, sometimes it came with a little girl's scream, and sometimes it came with a town that no longer remembered what loyalty looked like. For 3 days, Frank didn't leave the property. He spent the mornings walking the fence line with a hammer tucked into one hand and Ranger at his side, still silent, still watching. Some boards were mended, others were just checked and checked again. It wasn't about the wood. It was about the motion, the rhythm, the illusion of control, when the rest of the world had begun to spin too fast. The town was quieter now when it came up in the distance, but it wasn't peace. It was something else. The silence people fall into when they're deciding which side they're on, when they're watching to see if someone else will speak first. Frank knew the feeling too well. He'd felt it in forward bases and after ambushes, when nobody said what they'd seen, but everyone knew what had happened. Ranger had stopped sleeping by the door. Now he stayed by the barn each night, posted like a statue just inside the frame. He barely ate. He barely blinked. It was as if the tension in town had bled out to the edges of the property, and the dog could smell it in the soil. Frank tried to work, but even the horses were uneasy. They flinched more, paced in circles, watched the horizon longer before grazing. On the third night, one of them kicked open a gate and bolted down the pasture. Frank chased it in the dark with Ranger beside him. They got the mare back, but not before the fence had taken another beating. Back inside, Frank poured himself a shot of bourbon for the first time in almost a year. He sat at the kitchen table with the glass untouched and opened the folder again, the one marked Wild Iron. His contact at the VA had managed to dig deeper this time. The email was brief but came with scanned documents, faded names, redacted. Lines. Ranger hadn't just been assigned to the 77th Infantry. He'd been part of a subset known as Ember. No official existence, no public records. Only the words, prototype obedience neural trial, repeated over and over, buried under disclaimers. There was one phrase that stopped Frank cold. Do. Not reassign. Subject requires handler proximity for psychological stability. He looked up from the papers and found Ranger sitting there, watching him. He said. From that moment on, something shifted between them. The next morning, when Frank went to the barn, Ranger followed without hesitation. When Frank rode the tractor to the far pasture, Ranger trotted behind, weaving between grass and brush like it was second nature. He didn't bark, didn't chase deer, just followed. And every time Frank spoke, even if just to himself, Ranger listened. At the diner in town, people noticed. It had been months since Frank set foot in the place. But Earl had asked him to meet for breakfast, said he had something. That couldn't wait. Frank only agreed because Ranger had started to come when called, and somehow he trusted the dog more than anyone else in the world. They sat outside on the back patio, away from the tight booths and watchful stares. Earl brought black coffee and 2 plates of eggs and bacon. Frank picked at his food. Ranger sat beside his chair, silent, eyes sweeping every movement, every sound, like muscle memory he couldn't turn off. Earl glanced at the dog, then at Frank. "I'll be damned. He listens better than you do." Frank didn't laugh, but he smiled. "You're different, man," Earl said. "I ain't seen that look in your eyes in years. Hell, I thought I lost you." Frank sipped his coffee. "Still." "Here." Earl leaned forward. "You ever think maybe he's here for a reason?" Frank didn't answer right away, but when he looked at Ranger, he didn't see an animal anymore. He saw something else, something that had made it through hell and come out the other side, shaking, scarred, but breathing. That night, Frank pulled out an old book from a box in the attic. It was a training manual, thick and worn, from his time at Camp Lejeune. He sat on the porch steps, the book in one hand, a biscuit in the other. He whistled low. Ranger turned his head. Frank held up the biscuit. "Sit." For a second, the dog didn't move, but then, slowly, he lowered himself to the ground. Frank. He blinked. He turned a page in the manual. "Stay," he said. Ranger held his position. Frank's throat tightened. His hand dropped slowly, offering the biscuit. Ranger took it without a sound. It wasn't just memory, it was training. It was something more. Someone had taught him this. Someone he still remembered. It started with whispers. At the feed store, folks spoke softer when Frank walked in. Eyes drifted, toward the dog at his heel, then quickly away. When he passed the churchyard, old men paused their conversations. They didn't nod, they just watched. Ranger didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did, but didn't care. He kept close to Frank's side, steps matched, ears tuned to every passing sound. That morning, Frank stopped by the hardware store for nails and fencing wire. As he walked through the aisle, he heard someone mutter behind a shelf, "That's the dog from the shelter, the broken one." Another voice replied, "No, he's military. I heard he bit a handler overseas, got put down and somehow survived." Then laughter, nervous but there. Frank didn't say a word. He just gathered what he needed and paid in cash. As he left, the clerk behind the counter avoided his eyes. By the time he reached his truck, Deputy Kyle Reese was waiting by the driver's door. He wore mirrored sunglasses and a badge that sat a little too proud on his chest. His hand rested on his belt, fingers tapping near the holster. "Frank," he said casually, though his tone carried something else beneath it. "Heard you've got yourself a new pet?" Frank didn't answer. He opened the truck door. Ranger jumped in without a sound. "Didn't take you for the type to bring a war dog into town," Reese added. "That one there. He's not just any mutt, is he?" Frank met his gaze. "He's mine," Reese smiled thinly. "You know, we've got leash laws. Animal control's been asking questions. Folks say he growls when they walk past your fence, because they walk too close. Still, people are nervous, can't blame them. You bring a weapon into a quiet place, it's bound to stir the pot." Frank stepped closer. "That dog has more control than half the town." Reese's smile disappeared. "Just be careful. You're not in a combat zone anymore." Frank got in the truck and drove away, but the message had landed. That week, 3 more people approached him on his own land. One was a neighbor, Jim Tooley, who used to borrow tools and trade hay. Now, he stood at the edge of the property line, arms crossed. "You sure it's safe to have that animal around, Frank? My wife's worried about the kids, says she hears it pacing at night." Frank looked at him for a long time. "That pacing's the reason nothing's ever come through that tree line." Jim didn't reply. He just turned and walked off. Another neighbor filed a complaint. The sheriff's office left a yellow notice on Frank's gate. Something about unauthorized working animals, lack of certification, bureaucratic nonsense. He tore it off and tossed it in the fire pit. But the tension didn't stop there. One afternoon, as Frank worked by the barn, he heard a sharp crack, like a branch snapping, but cleaner. He turned fast. On the fence post near the north field, a fresh bullet hole had splintered the top rail. Ranger had already dropped low, eyes on the tree line, body tense. Frank scanned the horizon. Nothing, just wind and grass. A warning. 2 nights later, someone spray-painted the mailbox. Big red letters, sloppy and fast. "Put him down." Frank repainted the box the same day, not because he cared about the metal, but because whoever did it didn't know what it meant to earn survival. Ranger watched him paint in silence, sitting in the grass like a statue. Later that evening, they sat on the porch, watching the stars fade in behind the dusk. Frank reached down and rested a hand on Ranger's back. The dog didn't move, but his breathing slowed. "You didn't ask for this," Frank said. "None of it." Ranger lifted his head slightly, eyes scanning the edge of the woods. "They made you a weapon," Frank muttered, "then tossed you like a broken tool, and now they're scared of what they made." The wind picked up. Frank lit a cigarette, the first in years. "They're not scared because you're dangerous," he said. "They're scared because you remind them what they turned their back on." He exhaled and looked out at the fence line. "You survived something they don't understand, and people hate what they don't understand." The embers glowed softly. "In the dark." Ranger leaned his head lightly against Frank's boot. Neither of them spoke again that night. The morning was bright, too bright. The kind of day meant for parades, handshakes and paper flags waved by children who didn't know what they were cheering for. Main Street was lined with red, white and blue, little faces painted with stars, and small-town cheer forced through. gritted teeth. Frank hadn't wanted to go, but Earl had asked, said it would mean something to show up, said people needed to see him. Frank stood on the sidewalk near the old veteran's float, arms crossed, jaw tight. His boots were planted in the same place they always were, firm, silent. Ranger sat beside him, unmoving, a black shadow at his heel. The leash hung loose from Frank's hand, not because he needed it, but because some ordinance said he had to. The dog didn't tug, didn't fidget. He scanned the crowd the way Frank used to scan rooftops, alleys, windows with drawn curtains, always watching. It was all going fine until the girl ran up. She couldn't have been more than 6. Blonde braids, red dress, eyes full of sugar and noise. She broke from her parents, skipping forward, waving a tiny flag in one hand and a bright smile in the other. "Doggy!" she shouted. Frank didn't move fast enough. The girl reached out, hand extended, tiny fingers inches from Ranger's muzzle. The dog froze, body locked tight, ears pinned back, breath caught. Frank stepped forward, voice low. "Hey, don't..." "Too late," the mother screamed. Ranger didn't growl, didn't move, but the tension in his body was enough, the way his eyes fixed on the child's hand, not with violence, but with calculation, was more than enough for everyone nearby to see the worst. People backed away. Voices rose, phones came out. Frank stepped in, hand on the girl's shoulder, guiding her gently away. "He's okay," he said. "He didn't do anything." Deputy Reese appeared seconds later, one hand on the holster, the other already waving. "People back." His eyes were on the dog. "What happened?" he barked. "She ran up on him," Frank said. "He didn't bite, didn't touch her." The deputy stepped closer. "Is he trained to react like that?" "He's trained to survive." Reese pulled the safety strap off his holster. "I said," Frank repeated, his voice hardening, "he didn't do anything." By now, the cameras were rolling. Faces leaned in. Words started to spread before the truth had room to breathe. Into the trees, Frank followed. The trail was chaos. Twisted branches, broken underbrush. A path carved by panic. He pushed through it, heart pounding, lungs burning, until he saw him. Ranger was thrashing in a shallow ditch, his limbs jerking like he was trapped in a nightmare his body couldn't wake from. His teeth snapped at the air. His breath came in choking gasps. Lightning illuminated the dog's frame, soaked, shivering, lost. Frank dropped the flashlight and leapt into the mud. He tackled the dog sideways, grabbing him tight across the chest, locking his arms under the thick fur as Ranger bucked and twisted beneath him. A paw struck his chin. A tooth grazed his arm. "It's me," Frank whispered, gripping tighter. "It's just me." Ranger's body heaved. "You're not there anymore," Frank said, his voice low, broken by the wind. "You're not there. You're here. You're home." He didn't know how long they stayed like that, man and dog twisted in the wet earth. The storm raging overhead like war drums. But eventually, the fight went out of Ranger's muscles. His growls turned to whimpers. His body went slack. Frank didn't let go. He didn't let go until the thunder faded. Back at the house, the fire still burned. Frank guided the dog inside, both of them dripping, caked in mud and blood. He wrapped Ranger in an old wool blanket and laid him by the fire. The dog didn't resist. He didn't move at all. Frank toweled himself off in the hallway, breathing hard. His shoulder throbbed, and there was a cut above his eyebrow, but he didn't care. Not right now. He returned to the living room and sat on the floor beside the dog. "Whatever they did to you," he said softly, "whatever they left in your head, you're not alone in it." Ranger didn't respond, but when Frank stood to go to bed, something changed. The dog rose slowly, his eyes still guarded, his steps cautious. He followed Frank into the bedroom and curled at the base of the bed, not touching him but there. Frank lay back and closed his eyes, the sound of steady breathing behind him. No more pacing, no more guard duty. For the first time in years, they both slept. The frost hadn't yet lifted when Frank stepped onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. The sun was low, casting long golden lines over the field, catching in the thin fog that hovered above the soil. He watched. The horses nudged at the icy grass and listened to the distant sound of a hawk somewhere beyond the ridge. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. Ranger stood in the doorway. He didn't rush out, didn't bolt. He stood still, scanning the yard as if it were his first day on patrol. Frank didn't call him. He just waited. After a moment, Ranger stepped outside and sat beside him, his eyes alert but not frantic. It was the first time the dog had come out on his own. Frank took a slow sip and looked down. "Cold morning," Ranger blinked once. No growl, no flinch, just stillness. Frank didn't push. That was the thing about animals and people after trauma. Pushing only made them pull deeper into the dark. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. They spent the morning fixing a stretch of broken fencing near the southern pasture. Ranger followed him across the field, never more than a few yards away. At first, he just sat and watched while Frank worked. But as the hours passed, the dog started to move. He sniffed the posts, circled the tools. At one point, he even lay in the grass with his eyes on the horizon, like an old scout watching the tree line for movement. Frank hammered a nail into place and looked over his shoulder. "I used to do this with Sam," he said. "My dog from after the Gulf. Good nose, bad legs. Took a bullet saving my sorry hide." Ranger didn't look up, but his ears shifted toward Frank's voice. "I never told anyone that, not even my sister." He took a breath and moved down, the line hammering another post into the cold dirt. He kept talking about the fence, about the horses, about the VA check that hadn't shown up on time. And though the dog didn't answer, Frank didn't stop, because someone was listening. That night when a nightmare clawed through his chest and pulled him from sleep, Frank didn't wake up alone. Ranger was there, standing beside the bed, watching, with eyes that didn't blink. The dog didn't touch him, didn't make a sound, just stood there like he knew. Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Good boy." When someone brought up a name that opened wounds better left stitched shut, Frank stepped away and picked up the satellite phone from the counter. He still had a few numbers, some old, some buried, but there was one he'd never erased. One that belonged to a man who owed him favors. He dialed, static, then a voice. "Frank, I need access to Wild Iron files," Frank said. No preamble. "Everything." A pause. Then, "Jesus, Frank, that op was sealed, buried under clearance levels you don't want to tangle with. What are you even talking about?" "I found the dog," Frank said. "He's here. I'm looking at him." Silence stretched out like wire. "You're serious." "Dead serious." The voice dropped to a whisper. "Frank, that dog was flagged. He wasn't just recon. There were enhancements, unapproved trials, stuff I only heard rumors about. They shut it down for a reason." Frank gripped the phone tighter. "I want the handler's last known address. Elaine Rowe. Can you get it? I'll see what I can find. But Frank, be careful. If they find out he's alive..." Frank hung up. The rest of the day passed in quiet rhythms. Ranger followed Frank at a distance, never close, never far. When Frank hammered a new board onto the barn's west fence, the dog sat facing the hills, ears twitching at every gust of wind. When Frank checked the hayloft, Ranger waited at the base of the ladder, eyes scanning the tree line. He was watching for threats no one else could see. That night, Frank laid the photo beside the dog's bowl, just outside his reach. Then he returned to the living room, sat on the edge of the couch and waited. Ranger didn't approach it for hours, but just before dawn, Frank caught the softest sound, paws shifting, nails tapping wood. He glanced back in time to see Ranger nudge the photo with his nose, then settle beside it with a sigh so faint it almost wasn't there. It wasn't peace, but it was a start. The sun disappeared behind the hills, leaving the sky bruised and low. The house creaked softly in the growing cold, and inside, Frank lit the fireplace with slow, deliberate movements. Flames caught the kindling, licking up the dry logs until the room glowed in gold and shadow. Ranger lay in the corner, still as stone. He hadn't touched his food, hadn't moved since curling up beside the photograph. Frank sat in the armchair across from the fire, boots off, an old wool blanket draped across his legs. He held a book in one hand, but the pages stayed still. His eyes kept drifting toward the dog. He could feel the unease pulsing off Ranger like heat from an engine. Every noise drew his ears up. Wood snapping in the fire, wind scraping the window panes, the distant groan of trees. There was no rest in him, no ease. Even now, safe and warm, he watched the door like a soldier still on post. Frank leaned forward and set the book down. "You don't sleep, huh?" he muttered. "Not when there's a door that's not locked and a world that's still turning." Ranger shifted but didn't look at him. The fire cracked louder. Frank reached for the coffee mug on the table and found it cold. He stood with a sigh and walked to the kitchen, the wooden floor whispering beneath his steps. He poured another cup, black and bitter, just the way he'd made it since he got back. Then the thunder rolled. It started far off, just a low tremor, but it grew fast, deep and rising, like something was coming straight out of the ground. The windows rattled in their frames. Lightning ripped across the dark fields outside. Frank looked up just in time to see Ranger rise with a violent jolt. The dog's eyes widened, his ears flattened, his chest heaved, then he bolted. Before Frank could move, Ranger was sprinting down. The hall, claws skittering on the floor. The screen door slammed open. A cold gust slammed into the house like a fist. "Damn it, Ranger!" Frank dropped the cup, grabbing his coat and flashlight in one fluid motion. He burst into the yard barefoot, the gravel biting into his soles. The rain came down hard, sideways, soaking his clothes instantly. The beam from the flashlight swung wildly across the field. No sign of him. Frank moved fast, slipping through mud, calling the name he hadn't used in years. "Ranger! Ranger! Come back!" No answer, just the wind and the storm, the black of the woods ahead swallowing the world whole. He found the first paw prints near the barn, deep, frantic. They led straight into the hills behind the pasture. He grabbed the flashlight from the shelf and stumbled out into the night, the cold rain soaking him instantly. The yard was pitch black, and the wind ripped through it like a freight train. But over the wind, he heard it, heavy paws on wet ground. Something crashing through the underbrush, frantic and wild. "Ranger!" he called, but the name got swallowed by the storm. He followed the tracks, slipping down the slope behind the barn, through the mud and cold, until he found him. Ranger was thrashing in the field, his body writhing like he was fighting. Invisible enemies, howling with a sound Frank hadn't heard since combat. Not barking, screaming. Frank didn't hesitate. He lunged, tackling the dog into the mud, wrapping his arms around the trembling mass of muscle and terror. Ranger snapped once, teeth grazing Frank's shoulder, but then something in him broke, and he went still. Frank held him, rain pouring over both of them, blood and water mixing with the mud. "You're safe now," Frank whispered into the dog's soaked fur. "You're safe now." The words were shaky, not because of the cold, but because he wasn't sure who he was saying them to, the dog or himself. Minutes passed before Ranger stirred. Not to run, not to fight, just to nudge his head softly into the crook of Frank's neck. By the time they made it back to the house, soaked and shivering, the storm had softened into a distant rumble. Frank dried Ranger with an old blanket and led him into the bedroom. Without a word, the dog climbed onto the floor beside Frank's bed and curled there, eyes never leaving the door. Frank lay back, eyes wide in the dark, the thunder echoing somewhere far off. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. The morning light crawled through the broken window, casting fractured shadows across the wooden floor. Frank stood in the kitchen, one hand gripping a coffee mug, the other brushing mud from his pants. He hadn't said a word since sunrise. Across the room, Ranger lay curled at the base of the door, his eyes open but still distant, as if his mind were stuck somewhere far from Montana. The dog hadn't eaten, not last night, not this morning. Frank placed a bowl of kibble down gently and backed away, giving him space. Still nothing. Outside, the horses moved through the frost-bitten field, steam rising from their backs. Life on the ranch didn't stop for trauma. Fences still needed mending, tools needed oiling. But Frank stood frozen at the table, his gaze fixed on that rusted tag he'd clipped from Ranger's collar the night before. 77th Infantry K9, Operation Wild Iron, do not separate. He'd stared at it for hours, like the words might rearrange themselves into something less impossible, but they never did. Wild Iron. Frank hadn't heard those words in years, not since the operation ended in fire and silence, not since half his unit disappeared into smoke, and the government buried everything under concrete and excuses. That dog, this dog, was there. It made no sense. Ranger had vanished during the second ambush, the one that shattered the squad. Everyone thought the K9 was gone too, killed in the chaos or lost in the retreat. But here he was, alive, breathing, changed. Frank walked over to the old chest in the hallway and pulled out a thick manila folder from the bottom drawer. Inside were clippings, letters, photographs, pieces of a past he'd never fully unpacked. He laid them out across the table, slowly, his eyes scanning names and faces that had long since faded into memory. He found the old unit photo, 12 men, 1 handler, and Ranger, smaller then but unmistakable, alert, proud, his ears perked, standing beside a woman in combat fatigues with a crooked smile and sharp eyes. Elaine Rowe, captain, handler, the only one who ever understood the dog better than the rest. Frank turned the tag over, then flipped the photo to its back. A date, a location, coordinates he hadn't thought about in over a decade. He ran his thumb over them like a prayer. The dog stirred near the door. A quiet grunt, a shifting of limbs. Frank glanced over. "You remember her?" he asked softly, holding up the photo. Ranger's eyes narrowed. His body tensed. He didn't growl, didn't move, but something in him changed, like a thread had been plucked too hard. Frank set the photo down, careful not to spook him. He knew that stare. He'd seen it in men during debriefings. But the letters were still there. 77th Infantry K9, Operation Wild Iron, do not separate. For a moment the shelter disappeared. The cold tile, the barking dogs, the fluorescent hum, all of it faded. Only the desert remained. The heat, the smoke, the screams, the explosion, and a dog, not just a dog, that dog. Frank stood, his chest tight. "I want him." The girl blinked. "Sir, I don't think he's not adoptable. He's not like the others." Frank turned to her, his voice low but firm. "I said, I want him." No one argued with that tone. Papers were signed, rules bypassed with a few quick calls to someone higher up. The shelter director tried to warn him too. "He doesn't act like a normal dog," she said, eyeing the tag. "Doesn't trust, doesn't respond to anything. We think he might have come from some kind of military program." Frank didn't answer. He only opened the kennel. The dog didn't resist, didn't move for a long moment either. But then, without a sound, he stood, walked past the threshold, past the gate, past the fear, out into the cold air beside Frank. 2 shadows moved as one across the gravel parking lot, silent against the wind, no wagging tail, no joy. But there was something else, recognition. Frank Holloway drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly on the armrest, where his fingers twitched now and then, a habit that hadn't gone away even after all these years. The old truck rattled down the gravel road leading to his farmhouse, kicking up dust behind it like a trail of ghosts. Beside him, Ranger sat in the passenger seat, still and alert, his gaze locked straight ahead, ears twitching at every noise. The world threw at them. They hadn't spoken. Not that Frank expected the dog to talk, but even the silence between them felt heavy, loaded. Frank wasn't sure if he'd done something good or something foolish. But when he looked at the animal sitting beside him, he saw something that couldn't be ignored, something wounded, hidden beneath years of training and hurt. The farm was a modest stretch of land tucked into the edges of Montana's endless plains. A few horses, a rust-red barn, broken fences, and a house with more years behind it than ahead. Frank pulled the truck to a stop beside the barn and cut the engine. Ranger didn't move. Frank got out, circled to the other side, and opened the door. Still nothing. "Out," Frank said quietly. Ranger slowly turned his head and stepped down. Not reluctantly, but with the kind of practiced control Frank recognized too well. The kind born from training you never asked for. He led the dog to the porch. The old screen door creaked open, and the scent of weathered wood, hay, and memories settled in around them. Ranger paused at the threshold. He didn't cross it. Instead, he scanned the doorframe, the corners of the porch, the empty sky. "You still doing sweeps?" Frank muttered under his breath. The dog finally stepped in. Inside, the farmhouse was simple. Worn rugs, aging furniture, a few framed pictures, all soldiers in uniforms, all gone now. Frank watched as Ranger moved through the space, slow and deliberate, like he was walking into hostile territory. He didn't sniff, didn't explore, just mapped the place with his eyes, then lowered himself into a silent sit in the corner of the living room. Frank poured himself a glass of water and sat opposite the dog, placing the glass down between them. Ranger didn't touch it. They stayed that way for hours. Just two shadows caught in different decades of war, breathing in the same quiet. When night came, Frank laid out a wool blanket beside the fireplace. Ranger didn't move toward it. Instead, he sat upright near the front door, eyes fixed on the threshold, guarding it like he'd been assigned. Frank stood in the hallway and watched him. He remembered men like that. Men who wouldn't sleep unless someone else did first. Men who came back, but never really came home. "Suit yourself," he muttered and went to bed. Sometime after midnight, thunder cracked in the sky, splitting open the stillness like a scream. The house trembled, then it came. The sound of shattering glass. Frank sat up, heart pounding. He didn't need to guess. He already knew. He ran barefoot down the hall and found the living room window broken wide, the cold wind howling through the jagged glass. The front door was wide open, and Ranger was gone. Frank didn't think.